Why has Russia invaded the Ukraine? The main reason is Russia is acting out of self-preservation. You see, Russia is under threat from NATO. Now, I'm not saying NATO directly, I'm saying the USA, which is behind and controls NATO. Ever since NATO's formation, their only purpose is to counter the Soviet Union and their satellite states, which formed the Warsaw Pact. If you don't know what the Warsaw Pact is, look it up. It was a military alliance, just like NATO, that was formed soon after the Second World War, and it formed the opposing power bloc to the Western powers. NATO expanded, of course, over the decades. However, the Soviet Union collapsed over 30 years ago, so NATO's purpose vanished, basically. NATO no longer needed to exist. When the Soviet Union fell, NATO should have been dismantled, but it didn't. Now, NATO, make no mistake about this, NATO is openly hostile towards Russia, okay? And Russia knows this. So Russia is taking measures to protect itself from the Western powers. Now, in recent history, it's always the West that's invaded Russia. They've invaded Russia 4 times in the last 200 years. And I'm not talking about just small incursions, I mean full-on invasions. That's cost Russia enormously. So you see, Russia has good reason to fear the West. It's not the other way around. We're being told that there's this huge threat in the East, and Putin's a madman, and he just wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire, and he's deranged, and he's the new Hitler. Well, I'm sorry, but that's nonsense, okay? Putin is the only sane player at the table right now. All the Western leaders, if you can call them leaders because they're not, they're puppets. They're like marionettes with strings attached to their limbs being manipulated by higher powers. So you see there's a higher level of management above these inept jokers is what they are. So you see, Russia almost didn't have a choice. Okay, I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail, but that's the premise basically behind this invasion. Okay, so in the 90s, Russia was independent. It gained independence from the Soviet Union when that fell, and the West proceeded to pillage Russia. Not through an invasion, nothing like that, but through multinational corporations, and internally Russia was in quite bad turmoil. I mean, the Russian mafia, which I'm sure everyone's aware of, was the most ruthless, organized criminal elements in the world, probably. Yes, Russia was not a good place in the 90s, and certainly wasn't strong enough to stand up to the West, absolutely not. So when the West promised that NATO wouldn't expand, and then they lied, what do you think that did to Russia? It diminished their trust in anything the West, and more particularly the USA, has to say. So any time any promise is made by the West, Russia just doesn't take seriously. You see. After the 90s, NATO was beginning to expand, as they said they wouldn't, but they did. Now, NATO, like I said, is hostile to Russia. Ultimately, the West wants to break up Russia. They don't want Russia to be a superpower or even a regional power. They want to break it up and control it, because Russia has vast resources, and of course, the New World Order wants to bring every country under its control. Every country, no exceptions. And Russia is a huge obstacle to that. I mean, Russia is by far the largest country in terms of landmass. But population, I mean, I don't think it's even in the top 10. I think it's around 140 million, which is, it's a fairly large population. But compared to its size, I mean, Bangladesh, which is the size of England, has more people than Russia. Okay, so for its size, it's very, very sparsely populated. And I think 80% of Russians live in European Russia, that is, anything west of the Ural mountain range. Okay, so yes, historically, Russia has always been invaded by the West, and before that, it was the East. It was the Eastern hordes, going all the way back to the Huns of the 4th century, all the way up until the Mongols. And that sort of stopped happening when guns and gunpowder and firearms became available. But then it was the West that turned and started invading Russia every 40 to 70 years. The last invasion was World War II, and yes, the Soviets invaded Eastern Europe after that, but that was of course in response to the initial invasion that nearly destroyed, at the time it was the Soviet Union, of course. Now, listen, I'm not defending the Soviet Union at all, okay? I think the Soviets, especially the Bolsheviks in the early days, they were the most despicable people ever to have lived. I can go into that, but that'll be for another video. Certainly in the first 30 years of its existence, it was, I mean, it should have been, we should have let Germany go straight to Moscow and hang on the Bolsheviks and be done with it, because they deserve to burn. But Russia is not the Soviet Union, like I said in my previous video. Russia is far from the Soviet Union. They've shook off the yoke, Bolshevism, and they don't want to remember that time they were under Bolshevik rule. I mean, that was a turbulent time for Russia. So, everyone's afraid of communism and, the return of, the Eastern Bloc. But guess who the biggest victims were of communism? Right, the Russians, exactly. Now, I do sympathize with Poland, okay? Because Poland suffered tremendously under the Russians, all right? Make no mistake about that. Ask any Pole who were the worst occupiers, the Germans or the Soviets. And I'm pretty sure 10 out of 10 of them will tell you the Soviets, okay? They don't have a good experience being ruled by the Soviets. And even before that, they were ruled by the Russian Empire. So for them, they have this justifiable Russophobia, certainly more so than the rest of Europe. The Anglosphere, they have no excuse to despise the Russian. Okay, so let's fast forward to 2008, okay? NATO announced in 2008 that it would promise Georgia and Ukraine membership, much to Russia's disappointment. And the same year, Russia invaded Georgia. Very similar to what's happening now. Very similar. They marched into Georgia. It was a very short war. They just wanted to go in there and prevent Georgia and make sure they would not join NATO. Okay? And they confiscated some territories, which became small independent republics, recognized by only Russia and a few other countries. But anyway. So, in 2014, the West then sent in their agents of revolution and financed opposing parties in Ukraine who were pro-Western. They overthrew the Russia-friendly government at the time and put in the Western puppet regime. Okay? Now, this regime essentially put Ukraine under the control of the West. And when I say the West, I mean the United States and the war hawks in Washington. Now, Ukraine is a big country. If you look on a map, it's actually the largest country in Europe, except for Russia. It's bigger than France. It is a very, very big country. And it's also divided. It's not this homogenous country made up of a single people, that being the Ukrainians. No, there are quite a few other ethnicities living within the borders. In the east, and certainly the entire eastern half, they all speak Russian. And many of them are, in fact, Russian. Okay. So following this coup in 2014, the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence because they wanted nothing to do with a Western puppet regime that would subjugate them. So they were Russians. The people living there are Russians, okay? And they declared independence, and of course the central government in Kiev would not accept this, so they sent the military in at the demand of the Western powers, of course, the USA. They said, okay, go and crush the rebellion. Russia at this time was not in a position to invade Ukraine. I believe if they were, they probably would have done, but instead they helped the rebels in the eastern provinces. This war carried on for a number of years. They did reach these republics in the east, Donetsk and Luhansk, negotiated peace settlements in Minsk. There was an agreement called the Minsk Agreement, but the Ukrainian government would not honor this. Of course, when I say the Ukrainian government, I really mean the American government, you see. Now, people say, oh, well, Russia wouldn't negotiate with Kiev. Yeah, well, Kiev is not Kiev. Kiev is Washington. So the Russians will only speak with the Americans. Now, fast forward to last year, 2021. The Donbass, of course, that's the region in the east where Donetsk and Luhansk are. It's still under pressure from Kiev. And there's still an ongoing war there. Since 2014, I think it's something like 13,000 people have been killed. Does the media talk about this? Have they talked about this? No. There was some mention of, civil war breaking out back in 2014 after the Western-led coup, but it pretty much didn't get reported on for the last sort of 7 years after that. And the Ukrainians were, some might say, committing genocide. I wouldn't go as far as saying genocide, but they were certainly targeting civilians and killing civilians. But where was the outrage in the Western media? There wasn't any. So just before this invasion, just before Russia went in, the Ukrainian army was gearing up to do an entire sweep of the east and completely wipe out these two republics in the Donbass and just crush the rebellion completely. They were going to go in there absolutely guns blazing and probably flatten the place. Sanctioned by the West, of course. The West goaded them into this. They said, yeah, go ahead, we support you. Don't worry, Russia won't do anything. If they do, they'll have NATO to deal with. So they did that. The regime went in. Now, you have to understand, this puppet regime, the Zelensky regime, does not represent the people of Ukraine. Yes, some people might support it. The Western Ukraine is more pro-European, and they probably are more supportive of this regime, but the east of Ukraine certainly doesn't, okay? and that's why the 2 of these provinces broke away. Anyway, so they were about to go in and finish off this rebellion, but Russia beat them to the punch. The Russian army was ready to go in, and they went in. And now they have encircled the bulk of the Ukrainian army, which is in the east of the country, and they've encircled them in what's called a cauldron. That's what the Russian armies do historically. They surround their enemies, and they turn up the heat, and they give them the option to surrender or face annihilation. So I'd imagine this will be over pretty soon in the east. The Ukrainian army could not win against Russia. No way. Anyway, that's what's happening. Now, going back to NATO and why NATO wants to expand. NATO wants to expand so that it can encroach and surround Russia with the eventual ability to destroy Russia. Not necessarily with a full-on invasion. That would probably be pretty difficult because Russia has nukes. However, they would probably use the death by 1,000 cuts, you know, small incursions here and there, attempted color revolutions, assassinations, encouraging insurgencies like in Chechnya. I mean, that was a Western creation. The insurgents in Chechnya, which took Russia years to suppress, and then break up Russia into smaller, manageable republics, which they could then pick off one by one, and then eventually they would just engulf the entirety of Russia, and Belarus, of course. So you have to understand, Russia is acting out of self-preservation. That's their motive for this, because if they allowed Ukraine to fall to NATO, if you look at a map at where Ukraine sits, I mean, it's right on the underbelly of the Russian border. I mean, it's very close to Moscow. Not to mention, NATO's already in the Baltics, which is incredibly close to St. Petersburg. But if they took Ukraine as well, then they would be in a position to possibly attack from the Baltics and the Ukraine. Now, when I say NATO would attack, they would find some false flag. They'd find some reason to invade Russia, and then they could engage in a pincer movement around Moscow, surround it, and I mean, that's just one hypothetical. I'm not saying that would happen, but it's a possibility. So the other reason Ukraine is strategically important is if you look at southern Russia, that's where all the oil is, or a lot of it. If NATO were to have Ukraine, first of all, they would drain the Black Sea of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That wouldn't be possible for any maneuvers anymore, and that's the only warm water port that Russia has. The other ones freeze over in the winter. They would be able to essentially cut off southern Russia. If you look at the far eastern border, how close it is to Kazakhstan, and it's all open steppe. The Eurasian steppe, which runs from Mongolia all the way to Poland, it's just open country. There's no natural land barriers. I mean, yeah, there's the Volga River, but there's no mountain ranges. There are no natural land formations that would... no natural obstacles is what I mean. So that's pretty much it. Now, there's other political reasons. The USA wants to cut Russia off from Europe. You may have noticed Germany has canceled Nord Stream 2, much to its detriment. That was a huge mistake by Germany to do that. And now we are seeing an enormous increase in fuel prices with these new sanctions. So that's all I have to say for now.